Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl. Kyndryl runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more at Kyndryl.com. Today's book is a 3-part deep dive and shows us how to design the experience of failing. Research shows that repeated experiences of intriguing, constructive failure can help students and our own children and anyone we lead and us ourselves develop creativity and learn more deeply. When carefully curated, failure can become a signal for learning, not the noise detracting from it. The result is learners who gain a lifelong readiness to push themselves outside their comfort zone using setbacks as launch pads for learning and innovation. Our guests' principles are not just for designing learning for others, they're just as powerful for taking charge of and designing our own learning. Maybe you want to learn new knowledge, language, sport, or a new skill, and in part 2 of this series, we'll share how productive failure can be so transformative for our own learning. From setting up goals that get you out of your comfort zone to designing specific kinds of tasks that push the boundaries of your current abilities to developing a mindset that supports your growth, our guest describes a full set of design principles to harness productive failure for your own deep learning. It is a pleasure to welcome the author of this book, and I have 2 copies up for grabs, one digital and one physical. The author of Productive Failure, Manu Kapur. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aidan. It's lovely to be here.
It's great to have you on the show. And I haven't told you this, but we share a common background, which is the athleticism, the drive to be a professional athlete. I got a little bit further before I got injured. You got injured early. And I say that for a reason, because this apparent breakdown led to a huge breakthrough for you. So I'd love you to start with the idea of the dots that started connecting. Dot 1 was soccer.
Yeah, exactly. I was in India. I was born in India. I grew up in India, and as India, cricket is the most important game and the most popular game. Except I got into football. I got pretty good at it very early, and basically my teenage years, that's all I did. And by the time I was 17, 18, I was playing competitively and getting to the youth sides and so on and so forth. And I think it was 19 when I first got my ACL ruptured, but it hadn't torn down completely, and therefore the doctor said we keep rehabbing it. And every season I would get injured, and the 3rd season or so, it got fully, and then he said, now we have to repair it, to reconstruct it. And after that, very soon after, I had to give up. It was devastating. I was in my early 20s, 21 maybe, and there was everything that you dreamed of just suddenly comes to an end. And he said, okay, what else do I do with my life?
That idea, Manu, for people who have maybe children or nephews or nieces who want to be professional athletes, is one of the big mistakes we make is actually put all the eggs in that basket and not think about other baskets beyond that. So maybe a word of advice on that as well, because you did get there, but you got there because of your mindset.
Yeah, mindset, but I mean, it was tough still, right? Especially as a young person, it's really hard to focus on one main thing. I was also just lucky that in addition to playing football, I was somehow good in math. To do maths just came somewhat effortlessly. And so when I had to pivot to another thing, what else can I do? I fell back on engineering as my professional degree choice. But not every athlete has that choice either, right? And if you look at, especially post-athletic careers, many athletes suffer. Even if there's no injury, people suffer from depression and so on and so forth. So battling all of that while trying to pivot that early in life was quite hard, I have to say. So I finished up engineering school, and by the time I was done, the heart was not in it. I mean, I got a basic degree, a professional degree. I think that just kind of laid the pathway forward for possibilities, but yeah, my heart was not in it. Then I went into the startup world because that was the time, the turn of the millennia, the internet boom very quickly. It became internet doom. Both the startups failed. Then I went into a consulting company. again, within 2 or 3 months, wasn't something that I think I was at a phase in my life where you threw anything at me, it wouldn't work because of, the trajectory that I was on. But then, I was literally broke after that. And then I needed to, have something to live my life on. So an opportunity to teach came along. And I thought, okay, since I like math, I will teach math. I knew nothing about teaching, but let's just teach kids math. And yeah, that's when it kind of really clicked. I enjoyed teaching, and I also enjoyed teaching math in particular, because math is particularly hard to teach given its abstract nature. Language, things are hard to learn, but when things become abstract, and that's when kids really have a challenging time. Yeah, and then I enjoyed that, and the more I got into it, the more I got interested in mathematical cognition.
I wanted to pull out one thread, which was your maths teacher. So dot one was soccer, dots two was actually your maths teacher, which led to your love of maths as well. But your maths teacher giving you challenges and letting you sit with them, not helping you with the answer, because this sets us up then for later on.
So that was actually in engineering school, my final year thesis, I think you're referring to, where to graduate, you needed to do an honors project. And it's a year-long project. And I remember going to my professor and saying, hey, look, I like mathematics. Why don't you give me something that is math-heavy as my engineering project? So he said, oh, okay, fine. You take the set of differential equations and you try and solve them mathematically. And, off I went. I tried for a month or so, and nothing seemed to work. Came back to him. I went back to him and said, oh, this is what I've tried. He said, okay, good, but have you tried this other thing, other method? I said, no, I have not. So I went back and I tried that, and to my surprise, that did not work. So I went back to him and said, hey, the method you said doesn't work. So, oh, that's interesting. Why don't you try this? Yes, another method. And this went on for a few months, and we were at halfway point, 6 months down. Everything that I tried, including several of the suggestions that he'd given me, had themselves not worked out. And I was running out of time because my scholarship was on the line as well. And I had to graduate by the end of that year. And I should become panicking here. What should I do? We have not made any progress. He looked at me and said, no, actually, you've made a lot of progress. Something to that effect, I paraphrase. And I said, no, nothing I've tried has worked. Even the things you suggested haven't worked. And he said, no, this was intentional. I wanted you to understand the problem. Now that you've tried many ways, solving the problem that have not worked, you have a very good understanding of what the problem is, the beast you're trying to slay, so to speak. And I was obviously very, very angry, but I think on hindsight, yeah, he was right. Then he told me that, look, the problem is not solvable mathematically. It is not tractable in that sense. You have to computationally solve it. Then it was perfect. I was done and dusted within a month or 2 weeks, 6 weeks of running the simulations. And yeah, I got the highest grade for it even. Yeah, but at the time, it just felt awful that, you wasted so much. You've wasted, quote unquote, so much time. But yeah, that was deliberately designed failure. And it didn't, I didn't think back until I actually started my research on the topic. So it was not that I was constantly thinking in that moment, oh, wow, though the professor did was amazing. It was only 10 years later during my doctoral studies when I was starting to look back and connect the dots. Oh, yeah, actually, that made sense at the time. So perhaps a message to the audience is, yes, in the moment, you might not see the value because the dots connect looking back.
Absolutely. And as a parent, you try and design that for your children all the time as well, that that they're going to hate you in the moment, but it's the right thing in the long run as well. And I was thinking about your engineering teacher and the fact that the easy thing was just to tell you. It's like the easy thing is to just, I always use the example of packing the dishwasher. Just do it yourself instead of getting the kid to do it and they make a mess and they go through that period of making a mess and you correct them, etc. It's just easier to just get to the short run. And it's one of the big challenges in society as well. And one of the reasons I wanted to share the book. But there was all this. So these redirections, these failures, if we call them that, led you to your fifth choice career. I'd love you to share that, because this was the genesis of where you are today and the genesis of this book.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really started by my thinking when I was teaching math. I mean, I loved it. And my students also, we told me that I was a reasonably good teacher, pretty engaging. But what I started experiencing was a phenomenon that went something like, I could give a very good lecture, explain things very clearly. You have the students really engaged, asking interesting questions, etc. And you think that you've delivered a really good, every teacher knows in a classroom when that's been a really good class, right? Like, you have that feeling, both because the energy is there. Okay, but then when you come out and you start probing students' understanding, one finds that on the things that were covered in the lecture, students had no problem. But the moment you deviate, the moment you create something a bit more novel, you change a parameter, you get students to apply their understanding to things that they're not seeing, it was as if they'd not learned anything at all. And so that's what I started wondering. Why is it that even a very good, engaging lecture leads to poor learning? And it was only in doctoral school that I started to define the problem. The problem is not that we learn poorly from bad lectures. The problem is that we learn poorly from even very good ones. And it's not the problem with us, it's just how the human mind works and processes information. And that was a turning point for me. Like, okay, so now we've hit the problem. Just like in engineering school, once you understand the problem, once you can define and understand the problem, it becomes a little bit easier to solve.
I love your line, and I'm not going to take it away from you. I'd love you to share the first job of teaching.
Yeah, the first job of teaching is actually not to teach, it's to prepare the learner for the teaching.
It's such an important line, and I wanted to not take that away from you, because it's one of those lines that just sticks with you in every facet of learning. I do a lot of facilitation in innovation and change, and that piece, people launch into their strategy, and it's like you got to prepare them before that, because if they go head first into, I found it so valuable for lots of different things. Before we start launching into the book, I really wanted to share the importance of the salience or intention that we give certain elements, because this is key. And you say it's about seeing the deeper structure.
I mean, if you want to learn anything new, or if you want to understand something deeply, you need to be able to see. But it turns out seeing is not simply a perceptual exercise. It's not like I put the same stimulus in front of you. What you see would be very different from what I see. And especially if you put the same stimulus in front of an expert versus a novice in the domain. I'm no artist. I don't have any training in art. So if I look at a painting, I look at a painting, and I don't have that wow effect or real understanding. But if you have an expert looking at the same painting, they'll see things that are right in front. I still won't be able to see. Math is the same. Science is the same. It's not just about putting things in a logically structured, entertaining, engaging way. You've got to be able to see it, because we see with not just with our eyes, but with the knowledge that we have. And that's why teaching is so hard to a novice, because to understand something, a novice needs to be able to see that which is critical, the deep structure. But seeing the deep structure requires some knowledge. And by definition, a novice doesn't have precisely that knowledge. And so you're caught between a rock and a hard stone. How do you get out of it? So fundamental. And that's one of the reasons why people don't learn well from even very good lectures, because to an expert, that lecture makes perfect sense. And even to a student, it gives an illusion. But the student is not seeing. I think that's the fundamental takeaway. The student, the novice, is not seeing in that amazing lecture what the expert is. And so that's why the first job of teaching is really not to tell, but to prepare the novice. The telling is important. Preparing the novice for the telling is the most important.
The flip of that also came to mind, because oftentimes, if I'm doing a keynote or even my own book, I've written it to help bring people to the same level. But sometimes then you get an expert who'll look at that and go, that's way below my paycheck in a way. And they dismiss the content when there actually could be some learning in it as well, because when we'll come to this later as well. And I was telling you, I write an article each week, and I really zoned in on this, that the opposite is also true, and you can fall into the expertise trap.
Yes, that is true. I mean, and we have actually some findings from my research where especially if you develop your expertise by learning trajectories that are more telling oriented, then you're more likely to fall into the trap, because your knowledge is then not encoded flexibly that you think out of the box. Whereas and the Japanese psychologist talked about Hatano Inagaki, he has this idea of a routine expert, somebody is trained efficiently and they can do the same thing or similar things within a narrow set of constraints very well, right? But if you give them a new problem, a new situation where they really have to adapt, they find it hard. Yet there are adaptive experts as well who are very efficient yet very adaptable. And studies and expertise show that the learning trajectories of what makes an adaptive expert versus a routine expert are very different. The learning trajectories of adaptive experts are more productive failure kinds of trajectories, whereas learning trajectories of routine experts are more, I would say, the direct instruction, telling, and efficiency-driven trajectories. So there are kind of links between the learning parts and the learning outcomes that we're beginning to understand now.
There was a guest we did a series on for a long time with, Gary Hamill, and he said a very interesting thing that came to mind, which is we're in a world that's changing at a rapid pace. Everybody says every generation changes faster than one before. I think we are experiencing that at the moment. But one of the things he said was that many people who become CEOs of companies were in roles that were stable, like a CFO role for the old world, and then they come into CEO role, and it's an adaptive world, but they have been trained to that very point. So I'd love to connect that dot between that problem, and this is why you do see some companies and they hire failed entrepreneurs, if we call it failed entrepreneurs, and they hire them because they know that they have developed that skill that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's the power of failure. I mean, so let's unpack adaptation. That's one of the basic competencies that everybody needs to have because of the pace of change. And if you can adapt, and if you can adapt well, then you survive, you thrive. If you don't adapt, so what makes you adapt? Basically something that is a misfit or a misalignment. If everything is working in line with your, capabilities and interests, you don't need to adapt. You're in the right context where you're thriving. What makes you adapt is a misalignment, something that doesn't work, right? A failure of sort. So at the heart, if you want to develop adaptation, you want to give chances for people to adapt. And in effect, what that means is you need to design failures. You need to design misalignments between capabilities and goals and so on and so forth, very intentionally so that people can use that failure in a safe way, in productive failure, to build adaptive capability. So you're still learning your knowledge, but you're learning by pivoting, you're learning by failing, and the process of learning from productive failure, therefore you develop adaptive skills. And we see that in our outcomes, because productive failure students are more likely to be able to solve, adapt their knowledge to solve novel problems, which is exactly what one needs. So, and in the same way, if people build their capabilities over learning trajectories in which they've not had the need to adapt as much, then suddenly, if there's a lot of change in that, they will not be able to thrive, right? Because they have not built that stable routines. If you live your life in a stable country, you don't build that much adaptive. And I've lived my life in India versus Singapore and Europe, and the level of order and chaos are very different in different contexts. And it's really true. You somehow tend to lose your adaptive skills depending on which country you're living in. Now, factor that into learning. in learning. You can actually design for it. Yeah. And if you design it well using failure, then you're building it back.
Now, I'm going all over the place here, but the travel part that you in India and Europe and now in Singapore, that importance of travel for children, I always think about when they go and they do their Erasmus year or they go away and study abroad for a year, that it's more than just the learning in the college that they go to. It's the hustle, it's the struggle that they go to that also builds this skill.
Yeah. I mean, it's a variation theory, right? I mean, in a very general way, variation forces you to see things that you did not see. So when you go to a new place, a new culture, a new context, you think that it's the difference. You find things are done differently, people are different, and so on and so forth. But the only reason you see that difference is because you're comparing it with what you have. So and that comparison that helps you actually see yourself in a different. So to me, the best part of moving around the world has been, I have come to understand myself better. Because otherwise you're fish in water, you never know that you're a fish. Yeah. So that's why traveling is absolutely essential. So many reasons. But the more broader principle is just variation, because variation forces adaptation.
I'm going to repeat this for our audience as well, because the repetition is important as well, but also seeing it from different angles. That thing that you talked about is the seeing, is actually seeing the gap. And to see the gap, you have to actually create the conditions for the gap, which is traveling, or if it's a leadership team, it's trying to show, look, this is where the world has gone, this is where you guys are. But they discover it rather than being told as well. I think that's what I loved about this. And I'm linking this to your friend, Alessio Figali, a Fields Medal winner, one of only 64, and his observations that helped you on this journey.
And, people think that mathematicians and scientists in general, because they're successful, and Alessio is immensely successful, like he's in the top of his game historically as well, right? So, and people think, these people must be getting it right all the time. If you ask students and the experts, must be getting it right all the time. And what they don't realize is that even at that level, you're making a ton of failures. You're going down the wrong path all the time. And it's even with that level of expertise, because you're constantly taking on problems unsolved, right? So that's just bound. You're constantly putting yourself in that space where you're taking on tough challenges. So even if you have a high level of expertise, you're just no choice but to try different things, invent different things. And like, I think Alessio told me 95% of his attempts result in failure. I mean, a mathematician, teach that to a school-going kid and say, like, you think math is hard? Well, the Fields medalist fails 95% of his time trying to solve problems.
Like you said, trying to recruit people for your productive failure studies showed you that where nobody wanted to be involved with failure when it was actually being designed for as well. We'll come back to that, but the one thing I wanted to just point out was, and this is more on a human level, is that if you go to embark on something, like you even in soccer, that oftentimes you'll be discouraged by somebody. And one thing that emerged for me was that that's very dependent on who that somebody is, because of what you said, that if their level of learning or their level of understanding is hugely important. Because you said, for example, if I'm watching a soccer game with a very experienced player versus a coach, and particularly if it's a youth level coach, that they don't have the lenses to see deeply what's happening. And if you have a scout for a player like you, for example, and he can see, actually, it's not how many goals Manu scored, it's not how many assists he gave, it's what he did off the ball, it's the space he created, it's the weight of the pass. And I think it's such an important thing, because we miss potential in people in every aspect of life because of that difference of the lens of the person who's making the judgment. And then we listen to them not knowing that.
Yeah. And I think the more, even as experts, we have to realize that we have those lenses. And when I work with teachers or coaches, I tell them, you are judging people based on a lens. Do you have the meta ability to reflect on that and then be humble about how you're judging people, or be more reflexive about how you're judging people, because that's affecting the kinds of decisions they're going to make. So there's a consequence attached to it, right? So yeah, I think, and this is something basic research in human cognition and learning, right? And it's such a simple finding, but if you all take it very seriously, then I think it has the capability of making us all very humble and, by consequence, more effective.
That idea, beginner's mind, is something that also is so important in this book, is that the world will move on oftentimes, knowledge will move on, and that I may have built my knowledge base for a world that no longer exists. And as a result, I miss things. And one of the things I thought about a few years ago actually was, how difficult it is. I lecture as well here in Trinity College. One of the difficulties is correcting papers. And actually, for me, it's more than just the time effort that it is. It's actually, I don't want to get it wrong. And so I have that kind of emotional weight that comes with it. But also, I used to kind of see it as a bit of I have to go and lecture. I have to go and correct these papers, 100 papers or whatever. But now I actually changed it to be a learning experience. So the way I treat it now is, there's going to be some that are very bland and repetitive, particularly now when they're using AI. And we might talk about that, actually, the detrimental effect of using AI. I'm not going through the struggle, but I'm just plant that seed. But now I look at it through a beginner's mind. And actually, when you do that, you start to see differently. You start to pick up little bits, little nuances, maybe a phrasing or a research paper that they mentioned that you didn't know of. And I'll go down the rabbit hole then, reading, etc. So there's a real important thing there for people. Many of our audience, Manu, are leaders. They run companies now in times of adaptive change, and indeed change makers. And I'd love your observations on that.
One of the things that happens when you engage with novice thinking is, you have to understand it. And as an expert, it's very easy to immediately say, well, that's just not correct. Right. But it's quite another to find kernels of ideas or thinking in that misconception or naive idea that could still work. Right. And I give examples of that in the book from multiple contexts. And as experts, if we can always get into novice's head and say, okay, I know this person is not quite talking about it correctly, but is there something here that I can take away? Something that I can harness, something that I can use? That pushes your own domain knowledge. Understand a student, a novice thinking deeply, actually requires more domain knowledge than to just call it something is incorrect. And especially in education, when the teachers have taught using productive failure, I say, this is hard to teach because I have to engage with students' ideas. I have to engage with students' thinking. And when they describe something, it's not immediately obvious to them that the idea is not working. Then they say, well, why isn't my idea not as good as yours? Or why is yours better than mine? And the teachers would say, well, I can explain my idea correctly, but it's very hard sometimes to talk about a student's idea and say, why is this wrong? Or why is this not working fully? And to answer that question, your domain knowledge has to be really strong. And so the finding that we have in our research is our teachers are saying, hey, look, even basic concepts in mathematics, I now understand them more deeply than I did in university. I mean, these are math tools sometimes, right? These are basic concepts, but we just took them for granted. But now if I teach using productive failure, because I have to engage student thinking, I have to see from their lenses why it makes sense, and then tell them, here's how it works or doesn't work, and so on and so forth, compared to what I know. I understand the math better. Right? My domain knowledge becomes better. I think that's how I connect experts in any domain. I think the more you engage with novice thinking, this is how your own knowledge or your expertise would put you dear.
While I have it on top of mind, the use of AI, so you're seeing this, I'm sure, with students as well. And there's a huge temptation, not just students, everybody starting to use AI to do the thinking for them or do the struggle work for them. And as a result, like, why bother? Like, I mean that more than it's not a judgment. It's just that the brain cannot encode it if you've given it to the machine to essentially do the struggle work.
The principle is the same, which whoever, whether it's the human or the machine or the tool or whatever, whoever puts in the effort to make sense actually learns. If you jump in a pool, there's no other way of learning swimming but jumping and struggling and figuring out your stroke. You get on a robotic swimmer and then that can take you across the pool and then, I swam, I learned how to swim. Because the next time that thing is gone, that scaffold is gone, you're gone. It's the same with any tool, calculators to AI. If the tool is doing the thinking, then you are not.
Let's put this out there, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but your view of this as a paradigm shift in learning and teaching, that the shift to productive failure. And I say that maybe you'll explain. So you were reading Thomas Kuhn's work, 1962, the scientific revolution, but also the shift from Ptolemy's view to a Copernican view and how big that was. But also I was thinking about the difficulty in that change for you as well. So I was thinking about QWERTY keyboards and, the shift from a QWERTY keyboard to a Dvorak keyboard. A Dvorak keyboard, for those who don't know, QWERTY is, if you look down at your keyboard, any keyboard, QWERTY is in most English spoken computers, but there's actually a more efficient one because that was built for a typewriter. Yet nobody would change because it's so encoded to do it that way and we become so familiar with it. And I was thinking even that from the beginner's mind, the novice view that you said there, to go back and to do that work is an immense cognitive effort as well.
We get bootstrapped or locked into certain ways of thinking. And again, whether you're looking at research on children playing with toys to QWERTY keyboards, to particular mindsets, particular ways of thinking, this is very well documented. And again, it goes back to that idea of how you came to learn that thing. If somebody converged on a QWERTY keyboard, having tried multiple different ways, different keyboards, and then he got into it, chances are they will be able to adapt to another situation. It's like somebody, if you want to hire a programmer, a software engineer, and they can do the language of the day, the current language of the day, and they're experts in that and nothing else, versus somebody you see, they've been able to over time learn many different languages, and they're in the process of learning this one too. Which one do you hire, right? Because tomorrow the language might be different and the first choice may not be able to adapt. Although today, that's the best choice. Back to the idea, building adaptability in your variation in your learning trajectory, and failure just is a wonderful way of forcing people to adapt and learn in a safe way.
So that's set up because I don't want to lose. I'm trying to be cognizant of myself here and the audience learning with us. And I highly recommend, if you are learning with us, read the book as well, because you need multiple angles. So for this book in particular, what I did was I listened to the Audible and I read it. So I would read and I'd listen to the Audible on dropping my kids here, there and everywhere, that type of work. And it's really beneficial. And then doing this is another great way to learn. And then, Manu, one of the things I've always resisted is I always get people saying, hey, I edit shows, I do show editing. I take on that role myself because it's another bite of the cherry to learn from a different perspective as you're going through and you're trying to master the audio and stuff like that. So I feel so privileged to get these different angles to learn the content and see it from different perspectives all the time. And something always emerges during the editing process because you're in a different brainwave state and actually you'll hear it differently. But I teed this up, which is the Copernican view, the Jenga model, let's call it. Let's set that up before we get into the problems of learning.
Yeah. So, the idea is the people have theories about the world. Scientists have theories and theories about the world. And I'll have to go a bit deeper into this to explain. But people don't change their mindset as quickly, and neither do scientists change their theories as quickly. So if a contradiction, if you have a well-established theory that explains what you think it explains the world or the phenomena, then scientists are pretty tenacious. Like you'll have to get a lot of evidence to undo before you start to rethink the theoretical architecture or the theory itself. And so that's what exactly what happens. We used to think that the Earth is at the center of the universe, of the solar system, and everything, we could explain it. Yes, the explanations were very complex, but every new finding, slowly built up evidence against it, and to a point where people were building ad hoc explanations that were so cumbersome, so clunky. And that's okay for science, because science should move only when there is really compelling evidence that you should shift. And what Copernicus did was, well, you've got this entire delicate, and that's what the Jenga tower is, right? You've got the base, and as long as it's just the base is pretty strong. And on top of that, if you mount the thing and you say, oh, this thing doesn't work, this evidence is contradictory, this is proving very hard to explain, this is proving very hard to explain, you can see slowly the theoretical, foundation will still be there, but starting to be a bit wobbly. Copernicus did what he said, well, at your base, you have the wrong assumption. The whole thing is wobbly, not because the findings are you're removing pieces that are not working. The problem is at your base, that you're assuming that, the very basic assumption is wrong. And I think oftentimes getting to that part is the hardest. But if you can, and there are very few instances in science, when you do get to that, you have a whole revision of, a revolution. That's why it's called the scientific revolution. The whole revolutionary change into how you think about the phenomena. To us now, it's obvious sun is at the center of the solar system. That was not always the case. And that's the beauty.
And that's the difficulty as well.
That's the difficulty as
I
well.
think Jeff Bezos said something like, if you're going to be an innovator, you have to tolerate long periods of being misunderstood. And it's one of the reasons I was so keen to have you on the show to share this work, is because I'm sure you are, and you'd be in some cases reviled and attacked by people because you're challenging their view of the world, and maybe they've built an entire career on that old model, that old foundation. And it also makes one think how many more foundations are wrong that we've built knowledge on.
Yeah.
Because history only goes back so far. So we're basing it on histories that we don't even firsthand know. And it's just so challenging. And I wanted to just tip the hat to the change maker out there who actually is struggling through a new paradigm shift, and then tee you up to maybe tell us, well, that's what productive failure is.
When my first experiments came out, I tried to publish it. It was very hard to publish. It took me 2 years to get my first paper into a proper edition, to actually a very good journal. So it does take time. And I think at the time you take it personally, but if you look at it from a societal, from a scientific standpoint, and if you're coming at it, if you're rubbing, people the wrong way, or you have, disconfirmatory evidence, you're proposing a new way of thinking, then why should people believe you? Just because you did a couple of studies and you showed something? No, that's not how science. I mean, can you imagine if that's what it is every day or every year, we'd be pivoting to a new model. That's not stable either. So I think it's good for science that we try to only change. And even now, not everybody changes, but it only changes when there's enough evidence that has been gathered in multiple contexts, in multiple domains, across multiple fields and so on and so forth, multiple countries. And that's when you start to say, okay, now it's not just one or two studies that I'm talking about it. There's a lot of studies that I'm talking about it. And that's when you start to rethink. So I think 20 years on from that early work that I did, yes, there's more support for that, but it's still not completely revised. I think, yes, the traditional models, that they are rethinking the theoretical models, that change is happening. Change happens slowly.
And the difficulty for the change maker to tolerate that, I think this happens on a micro level in every organization where somebody says, oh, our strategy needs to change, or we need to change our business model. They all go through a version of that, and it can be very lonely and disheartening, and they can give up very, very soon and actually leave the company. But I think that's an important message, and I'd love you to share your message of support, maybe your message of how to tolerate those periods of disencouragement, to those periods of attack sometimes.
Again, they all feel bad, right? In the moment, they all feel bad. But the good thing about learning, if you have a lot of learning through productive failure, over time, you come to treat these attacks or discouragement and so on and so forth as signals for learning. So if I'm trying to do something, if I'm a change maker and I just put the problem on its head, right? Suppose if I'm a change maker, I'm trying to change things, shake things up, and nobody is upset with me, right? Then am I really a change maker? This means I have not done anything that is rubbing people in a way that's forcing them to rethink, adapt, do things differently. And if you're getting no feedback that you're making people uncomfortable, that you are making think in a different way, that some people may not be happy about it, that some people are struggling. If you're not getting that feedback, either you're an autocrat, or B, you're really part of the system. That means you're not really doing anything. So over time, I think you don't take it in a flippant way. You look at the feedback, you consider it seriously, but you also take it as a signal that, okay, that means I am doing something. I'm really going to change the system, change the process, change the structure. And part of that is what I call the failure signal. It's, at times I go to innovation labs or companies invite me to, after you set up an R&D setup and we have so many projects, would you come and have a look? And there are times when you go and, you visit, it's a nice set of 10, 20 different projects within a company. And they say, good, how many of these are actually working well? And they say, they're all working really, really, really well. All successful projects. I said, wait, did you call yourself an innovation? I said, yeah. I said, no, you're not an innovation. You're a safe success lab at best, because if you're really pushing the boundaries, I would expect there to be a failure signal. I would expect people, let's say, half of projects went nowhere. Not because of laziness, stupidity, incompetence, but simply because we challenged ourselves, we tried to be creative, and in that space you're bound to have that signal. But you can take it negatively, or you can actually turn it into, so my work with organizations and, leaders and managers is, where is your failure signal in your teams? Are you only seeing a success signal? Then please, you're not innovating at all. So it's like turning the mindset, turning to see the same information coming in from a productive failure lens. And then you say, okay, if that's happening, that means something good is brewing here.
Exactly. They're all stepping stones towards success eventually. There's a line I have for Manu, which is the resistance. You were saying about, if you're not getting that resistance, you're not really doing any transformative change anyway, that you treat the resistance to change as a milestone, not a millstone. And it's just the same thing where it's like, you have to get that. If you don't get that, you're not pushing the boundary far enough. So I'm totally una voce with you on that one, man. I'd love to keep going on to the problems of learning. And with your permission, can I share the Venn diagram, the three circles? And I'd love you to talk to this. So this sets us up then when we get into solving for this, but this is learning on every aspect. So for people who maybe think this is just to do with education, it's way beyond it. It's every aspect of encoding information.
I talk about three problems of learning: the remembering, the understanding, and the transfer. Remembering has to do with obviously seeing things. You can't remember if you don't see them. And we talked about seeing already, right? And the way to remember things is to again, I talked in the book about the theory of disuse, where remembering is about both how well you store, how strong the storage strength is, and how strong the retrieval strength is. So just because you stored something well doesn't mean you're able to retrieve it, right? And these two are like orthogonal dimensions. And one thing that helps retrieval, basically remembering is a retrieval exercise. You retrieve something from your memory. One thing that helps retrieval is failure. So, if I go up to you and I say, hey, is your name Mark? And you say, no, it's Aidan. I'm more likely to remember your name than if you would have told me, Franco, I made. Right. So remembering is getting people to store information in ways that they are retrievable is one part of the problem that we need to solve. And proactive failure does that. Second is understanding. So even if understanding is a function of how well integrated new knowledge is with what you already know, what your priors. And it seems like a very trivial, obvious thing. Oh yeah, I integrate new knowledge with my old knowledge, but a novice and an expert both do not know what a novice actually knows. Right? One definition of novice is that they know very little. Another definition of novice is that they don't really know what they know. I'm becoming Rumsfeldian here, but but you know what I mean, right? So, and a big trick in solving this problem is to try to understand, well, how does a novice think about this thing that they're about to learn? And again, failure is a very important mechanism to make them pivot, make them adapt, and each time they do, they uncover something that they're about to learn. So remembering and understanding. And ultimate case transfer. Transfer is about, have you learned things in a way that you can use them flexibly to adapt? So, I mean, here, example I give is playing with Legos. So, there are two ways in which you can play. You can play Lego with predefined assemblies. You're making a car, or you're making a plane, and you go through the instruction booklets. I'm sure your kids have played with it, and you know from the outset that you're going to use this set of Lego pieces to make a plane. Okay, nothing wrong with it. Or you can have Lego that doesn't have a goal necessarily. You can make a plane, but you can also use the same parts, reassemble them, and make them into a helicopter, and so on, right? And the question is, if the goal is to learn how to make a plane, then yes, the first part seems very good. But if later the plane needs to be turned into a helicopter using the same parts, it's not going to transfer very well because of the way you got to learning about it. And so transfer is, again, just like remembering, just like understanding. Transfer is this flexibility in how you encode that information so that you can retrieve it and use it. And so these are the three problems that you need to really solve. And if you can solve them well, and my argument is failure is at the heart of solving them well, if designed in a safe way, then that's how that leads to deep learning.
The Lego thing is more than just children. I think it's a signal of society in a way that everything's to a recipe. And if everything's to a recipe, how can you explore outside the lines? We had a guest on the show, Peter Campo. We spoke about this. He wrote a book called The Emergent Approach to Strategy. And we used the example of Lego and said, the problem is that you have the instructions, but when you're trying to build a company or innovate, there are no instructions. You're going to have to just have the Lego blocks, whichever ones you have in your resources.
Right.
And it's a huge problem. Sure, you have some type of analogy used for innovation companies when you talk to the labs.
It's exactly that. It's where are your Lego pieces and how have you learned them? Have you only learned to use them in one particular way? Or are they reassemblable, repurposed? Or can you repurpose them as well? And most people find, when we say people are stuck in a box, including experts in a box, it's their Lego pieces have been assembled in one way. They've only seen one assembly, the correct assemblies. They even know which piece is a wing and which piece is a wheel and which piece is a nose. They know all of it. But can they take the wing and the nose and the body and the wheels and repurpose it into something else? Intuitively, it should be possible, but it just doesn't.
Yeah, I'm going to throw this out to any parents who actually, or maybe aunties or uncles, who've bought a Lego kit for their kids and then observed them that sometimes it's you, the parent, who wants them to follow the instructions and build it perfectly instead. And they have a desire maybe just to build whatever. And one of the nice things that happened in my life, Manu, is that my older kid he always had a propensity to be more innovative or more creative. And the younger guy would follow the rules. And I kind of always wanted the younger guy to break the rules. Like he's a kind of, this teachers love him and never does anything wrong. And I'm like, I want a little bit of reveled a bit of deviance
Yeah.
from him.
Yeah.
But the older guy then now sometimes, so they've broken their Lego kits. They had tons of Lego, all Batman stuff, all broken down, and now they just free play with the Lego every so often. And I love seeing that because I much prefer that. Yeah, my wife is almost OCD and she wants everything really neat and tidy, and she hates that.
Did you say your wife is OCD? You're sleeping on the couch tonight?
Don't worry, man. She definitely doesn't listen to the show. So even when retrieval results in failure, you say it is still beneficial for learning new information. That's the key takeaway here. There's something I'd love you to share as well, which is the dual index model of our memory, storage strength and retrieval strength. And Bjork's study, and they call this the theory of disuse. This is an important building block, I thought.
Basically, the theory is like there are two, you can think of memory as having two parameters. One is a storage strength, the other one is a retrieval. So storage strength is how well you stored that information. So your own birthday, your wife's birthday, I hope, and your kids' birthdays and other information about of your work, your domain knowledge. These are things that are stored very, very well, and they have very high storage strength. And other things, we have very low storage strength, like something you just heard, but and that is not stored. You knew you had it, but you can't remember. Like, and then retrieval could also be very high. So I gave you examples of your password, for example, is something. Although people make mistakes with that, but passwords are a typical example where you use it every day, and therefore your storage strength is high and your retrieval strength is high. Information about family storage strength is high. Your native language storage strength is high, retrieval strength is high. But there could be things that our storage strength is high, but retrieval is low. So maybe the math you learned in school, for example. At the time, you really learned a lot of math. Maybe you did very, very well in math, or pick any other subject. So the storage is there, but now if I ask you to do some differential calculus, you're going to struggle, right? But if I give you a chance to restudy, you will pick it up reasonably well because the storage is there. You reactivate it. You learn how to retrieve it. So high storage, but low retrieval. Then, of course, let's cover the case where there's low storage and high retrieval, something that we just talked about. We just had a Lego joke. I always remember that your wife is OCD, who doesn't listen.
Oh, boy, you're definitely going to get me in trouble.
Stuff. So again, haven't stored that information, but retrieval is high in the moment. And then there's stuff where there is low storage. So this is an example of low storage, low retrieval. And then there are cases where it's low storage and high retrieval, which again, things like, memes or something like that you may come across. So the storage strength is okay. One can store a lot of information, and in our long-term memory, that capacity is almost infinite. The interesting thing is in the retrieval way. So if you don't use something, you lose it. So there's decay and how else. So we studied all of that. But it turns out that when you learn something, and you allow for some forgetting, you allow some decay, and then you try to remember it. And when you remember it, and if you fail to retrieve that information, that is actually a learning event again, because if you get feedback on it, right? So, we had a conversation today, and then maybe a week from today, we allow for some forgetting, and then we say, did we talk about this issue? And he went, I don't remember if we did. And you try really hard to retrieve, and then they try to say, remember this segment that we talked about? Oh, yes, now we did. It turns out that I just made that into a learning event, and your retrieval failure actually set up the conditions for you to then encode this information even more strong, right? Thereby increasing both your storage and your retrievals. So failure of retrieval, again, as you said to the audience earlier, is a really powerful mechanism. We should not be worried about it, but if you can use it, you can hack it in a way that you allow some decay in your remembering things, and then you use retrieval practice, especially that leads to failure, and then you get feedback on it. That is very powerful.
I was thinking about that from, say, organizational learning. So let's get beyond the learning environments like at university or school and go, okay, people who have established careers now, and we're like, our organization must be more innovative. Do a half-day course, and they do that half-day course, and that's it. And they expect them then to be more innovative. And this is the big problem in an age where we're in an adaptive age. And there has to be consistent investment on that to happen. And again, to your point, I loved how you phrased this. We tend to think of forgetting as bad. It turns out forgetting can be good. We must remember to forget so that we can use forgetting to remember. I loved how you said that. Productive forgetting, you call it. But that on an adult learning basis, when people need to reskill and unlearn and relearn, is so important today.
Yeah, but I think in an adult situation, it should the forgetting should happen even faster, because you're thinking about so many things. I mean, there's so many things in your plate: life, work, family, etc. Right? So if you're learning a new skill, you're going to a new class, I don't know, pick up some AI skills, or or culinary skills, or linguistic skills, or whatever you're learning as an adult, because there are so many demands on your capacity, on your cognitions, that whatever you learn is bound to fade faster than as a child who just thinks about that one thing, and then I can remember all 100 types of dinosaurs effortlessly, right? Whereas an adult, it will be very, really hard. So I think we just need to, as adults, we need to understand that there is a power of forgetting, provided we then use retrieval. So if you're learning skills or new knowledge, then try to use that. And I describe this in the book. And this is a hack that you could use. We think that, for example, just mass practice is very good, but actually mass practice with some forgetting, and then practicing again with some. These are robust techniques for you to get on a faster, more flexible trajectory for learning new things.
And your friend's analogy of walking a path.
That's the idea. Like if you just take one path all the time, it's very clear, and but over time you have multiple meandering paths. That creates a different kind of, but then that also creates different ways to retrieve that information.
I thought we'd share as well the difference between, and this is where we talked about the expertise thing. We teed this up nicely earlier on. In 1946, Adrian de Groot was the first to demonstrate the difference between grandmaster chess players and lesser skilled chess players. I'd love you to share this. This really brings it home.
It basically shows how we use knowledge to see things. That's what experts do. So this is very simply, and that study is that compares expert chess players with not as expert chess players, but still very good with chess players, right? And the point of that study was to show that, if you give expert chess players a chess configuration, right, and to memorize it, and then you give the same configuration to a less expert or a novice to remember, the differences in memory would only appear if the configuration that you asked them to remember was actually a proper play configuration, right? If both were given a random configuration that makes no sense from the chess standpoint, both grandmasters and less than grandmasters will appear equally bad in their memory or equally good in their memory. So that, and several studies have shown since then, and they've kind of nuanced the finding, but basic idea is still this. If you give domain-based information that makes sense, because of your expertise, you can remember a lot of it. But that does not mean that your memory is actually better than a novice in that domain. What's making you appear to have very high memory is your domain knowledge, because that allows you to structure information in ways that you can effortlessly deal. A novice does not have that, but they still have the basic capacity on average to be able to remember things. So again, knowledge, domain knowledge and memory capacity kind of interact. And that study was phenomenal because it disambiguated, because you tend if to beat chess, you have to have a perfect memory or something like that. And there are extreme cases where people have photographic memories, and But for the mainstream, I think the study was quite a good one. That you need domain knowledge. We use domain knowledge to structure information and remember it.
I thought about that actually when the famous story where IBM's computer beat Gary Kasparov, and I wondered, was it a little bit of that? Because you were like, well, the chess masters will see recognized regular plays, but some crappy play might actually catch them off guard. And I thought actually about how, you know this from soccer, sometimes playing a crappy team from a crappy league will beat a professional team because they
Yes.
don't play to the same way that you play, and they might do stuff differently. You're kind of going, what the hell is going on here? If they play to a different playbook.
That's right. And yeah, I mean, it's exactly right. I mean, I think about the draft, that's a very good example where you can trick your high expertise, high expert or a better opponent into, and teams do that, right? I mean, even football teams do that. They deliberately go on a strategy that tries to destroy the flow of the game or things like that. So teams do that to put that to good use, at least in terms of outcome.
And certainly the business environment and certain leaders in the world are doing that to everybody today.
Well, there you go. Yes.
Certain coaches. But there's a great line here. Seeing depends upon what we know. We use our knowledge to see things. The exercise is not merely perceptual, it's also a cognitive one. And it is seeing the deep structure that leads to understanding and powerful learning. In the context of learning something new, we quickly run into a paradox. If you are learning something new, you are a novice with respect to that target knowledge. So you give the beautiful example of Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost, the beautiful poem.
And the idea, again, is like you can read a poem as you're a novice. If you don't have the training as a poet or literary training, if you don't have the cultural context, or if you've lived in in Greenland all your life where there are no forests to begin with, or maybe there are, maybe the desert where there are no forests to begin with, then you'd have a tough time understanding what the poem was about because you just don't have the knowledge to even interpret the reality, right? For the poem what was talking about, let alone the devices, the linguistic and other devices that the poet is trying to use to make sound sense, right? It's in that sense that I said that, yeah, seeing is a function of knowledge, and experts would see very different things from novices. And it's not just a poem, it could be a piece of art, it could be a proof in mathematics, it could be a diagram, an engineering diagram, it could be anything, watching football, anything. And that the same logic holds.
I thought we'd mention a couple of more building blocks, which was Schoenfeld's paper, Alan Schoenfeld's, Daniel Schwartz and Bransford's paper as well, because these were really important. The paper, A Time for Telling, and then, of course, as you alluded to earlier on, When Good Teaching Leads to Bad Results.
Yeah, so Schoenfeld was, he wrote the seminal piece in the late 80s where he went into math classes, well-taught math classes, and he studied the lecturers and how they were teaching. And by all accounts, they were very good lecturers. The same experience that I had as a teacher. Maybe I would have, I also thought that I was a very good lecturer, and sometimes you got that feeling. And then you also ask students if they were understanding the material, and they said yes. And but when you probe understanding after the concept, after the lecture, that's when he found the understanding to be weak, and that's exactly led to the definition of the problem. It was the problem: why are people learning so poorly from well-taught courses, well-taught lectures? And the problem is that we learn poorly from good ones. We of course learn poorly from bad ones, but particularly from very good ones even. And Bransford, Schwartz and Bransford paper, Time for Telling, basically then said that, telling, it doesn't mean telling is not important, right? Because you could take Schoenfeld's work and say, well, even good telling it doesn't work, so why do we bother, right? But I think what Schwartz and Bransford said was telling is important. And the reason it's not working the way it should be working is because you're not preparing for the telling. Right? So how do you get your novices, you give them enough background knowledge, enough activation of their priors? What protocol, what methods do you use to get the knowledge in, get the novices into a state where the telling works? The analogy is like growing crops, farming analogy. If rain falls on farmland, something would grow, hopefully. Something would grow. But in preparation for the rain, if you till the land, you do everything, you fertilize, you prepare, sow the seeds in the right, instead of random, you sow them properly and do all the prep work. And then rain, it'll grow in a different way, in a more effective way. You're more likely to have a good crop that year. And is rain then not important? Good rain is not. Good rain is important, but you have to do the prep work before so that you derive a bigger bang for the buck from the same good rain.
And this is a big problem, isn't it? Where time is a pressure. When, for example, the teacher themselves or the lecturer themselves don't want to put that time in, or have the cognitive dissonance to go that they listen. If they would listen to this show and they go, actually, I suffer from that, where it was a perfect lecture, but I don't want to then go and ask the students, did they understand? Because I don't want to know, because I want to keep moving. I need to get home. I have a soccer match to get to. There's all those human challenges behind all of this. A couple of last things I'd love to finish on was the importance of context, situational context. So cognition, where it's encoded with the physical area as well. This was a tough one for me, because I was thinking about how in my work often I'd get the executive team out of the building so that they think differently straight away, that they're in a new environment and they're in a novel environment, so the information will encode better. But then the other thing was, I was like, well, that's a kind of a challenge to the whole idea of situated cognition, or the home advantage effect. There's a lot in here. Maybe you'll give us an overview of this.
Yeah, so maybe I start with the home advantage effect just to explain the idea of situated cognition. And that is, teams generally tend to perform better on home grounds than on away grounds. Because you're having the same set of skills and knowledge that are at play. You're applying similar, you're used to all the tactics and everything. Yet, given the same team, on average, they perform better at home because they train at home. And when you train at home, you're not just training the particular skills, you're training the angles, you're training the scenery, you're training the sights, the smells. You get used to the dimensions and angles of your perspectives in the stadium that you're training in. You expect crowd sizes, and all of these things are being encoded. So the next time you take a shot from outside the penalty box, the angle is exactly, you've seen that day in, day out. And you can execute that because everything comes together to execute that. Same chap in a different stadium, which is you go once or twice a year to an away ground. Everything looks different. It's the same free kick. It's the same angle, but it just appears very different because the lights, the sound, people, dimensions, perspectives, everything is different. Not just the team is different. So, and this is what leads to the idea that knowledge is not independent of the context within which it was learned, right? It gets tied to this. So you're encoding everything around it while you're learning math. You're encoding everything while you're learning science or while you're playing football. You're encoding all of it. And when you need to use this knowledge that you've learned, if the context is very different from the context in which you learned it, then this knowledge you're going to have a harder time execute or retrieving it or using that knowledge at the same level of fluency that you want to use, right? Now, this may at first seem contradictory, right? So you would say, well, then how do we get people to encode flexibly? So if the goal is really to optimize, if the training context and the performance context is actually similar, if you know that, then you optimize by making the training context exactly like the performance context. But if you know that this knowledge that you're learning how to train is going to have to be used to good effect in a number of contexts, then you have to train this knowledge in some variable context as well. So your question about your executives, if what you're training them needs to be applied only in the context of their organization or in the company, in the same building, whatever, you better train them in exactly where they need to work. Like if they're on a production line, train them on the production line. Don't take them to a new production line and then, come back and say, oh, well, this looks very different. Right? But if you want this knowledge to be flexible, then you want to take them out to the woods. So you want to take them out to another company, or show them different things, talking about the same thing, discussing the same issues, take them out to point is then the information gets encoded in a bit different way, and it's tied to different context. So that given an entirely new context, they have multiple paths to retrieve it, multiple ways to access that information and use it. So that's the
Brilliant.
I know it's a bit of a counterintuitive.
No, it makes sense now, actually. So the getting out of the building idea actually works in that respect if it's cognitive, if it's flexible knowledge. But if it would say safety training that you might want to do it on site, that's really, really helpful. I thought we'd share as a final message the thought experiment and maybe test the audience here. So this is, imagine you're a child and you love playing with toys. I'll let you tee it up and then we'll give them 10 seconds. Not 10 seconds, because that'll feel like 2 minutes on audio. So let's set this one up and then deliver what the moment is here.
Right. So, people have studied children at play, it's a good indication of kinds of capacities we're born with and develop very early in life. Try to explain how we grow. Okay. So, toddlers at play, small children at play, and children love to play with toys. So they experiment in this broad genre of experiments that I would generalize to these two groups. Suppose you're a child who loves to play with toys, and I come to you and you decide yourself whether you're in group 1 or group 2. Okay. So if you're in group 1, I come to you and say, hey, kid, here's a new toy here. You've never seen it. You've never played with it. Do you want to play with it? And you say, oh, okay, I want to play with it. Like I said, okay, here's a toy, play as you like. And I observe how you play. And then I go to, if you're in group 2, I come to you with the same toy, same instruction. I say, well, hey kid, this is a new toy. You've never seen it. You've never played with it. Do you want to play with it? I said, yeah, I also want to play with it. I said, but wait, you don't know how to play with this toy. You don't even know how the toy works. So let me first teach you how this toy works. Watch and learn how to play with this toy. And then I show you, if you press this button, this happens, and you turn it around, that happens, and so on. I show you how to play with it. But then I say, now that you've learned how to play with it, I want you to play as you like. You're still free to play as you like. And I observe both the groups. Question is, if you compare the two groups, which child in group 1 or group 2 would be more engaged with the toy? Which child in group 1 or group 2 would invent more strategies to figure out how the toy works? Which child would be more creative in that process? Which one would you choose if you're the audience? Is it group 1 or is it group 2?
Your time's up.
Yeah. And in most cases, I've given talks on this several times. And for most people, it's very, very intuitive. And that's exactly what happens. It is the group 1 kid who's not been given the canonical knowledge about how to play with a toy, yet they are the ones who are more engaged, more creative, almost acting like scientists to figure out how the toy works. Yet, when we think of, new ideas and new knowledge and things we want to teach people, we don't give them the group 1 kinds of experience. We tell them, well, you don't know this, let me show you how to do this. And then you learn. And guess what? Yes, they learn that thing, but then they're not creative with it because you've got them in that box very early. And what productive failure tries to do is not group 1. What productive failure tries to do is designs a failure-based activation system and through exploration and idea generation, but it doesn't just leave it there. It then times it with consolidation. So it's a combination of exploration followed by consolidation and repeating these cycles again and again and again. And this combination is what results in deep learning.
And that, by the way, Manu, is such a backbone of this show, is the idea that we're taught, we're designed, we're encoded for exploitation of an advantage, very rarely for exploration. And actually, the explorers are more the deviants in society because of the education system as well, because we're trained for factory work, really. And this is why I'm so happy to share your work and get it out there, because we need this, and we need this at an early level in life. And it does probably happen naturally at an early level in life, like the Lego.
His next book.
But we take it away. You know, I think Einstein said, you know, I survived the education system.
Still, yes.
But your work in Singapore, I was impressed by the fact that it's been encouraged there. You know, I hear the Singapore system is ahead of many other parts of the world. So it just shows you that they lean into the future and they're very much on point.
Yes, I think one of the advantages here in Singapore, the policymakers look at science and they really consider the science behind it. Science does have a seat on the table. I mean, science is not the only thing that inform decisions, because policy decisions are obviously more complex than just one factor. But at least science has a good seat on the table.
And for anybody else who wants a seat at the table of this book, don't forget there's one up for grabs with our newsletter on Substack. I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I learned so much, and I took a long time to actually encode this knowledge. I'm delighted to get another way to encode, another medium to encode it with the author of that book. Manu, for people who want to find you, where's the best place to reach out?
Well, you can go to our website, manukapur.com, the book, productivefailure.com. It's also available online on booksellers. You can view my talks and everything. There are multiple modalities in which you can access the work.
Brilliant.
It's all that.
Eating his own cooking as well. Author of Productive Failure, Unlocking Deeper Learning Through the Science of Failing. Manu Kapur, thank you for joining us for part 1.
Thank you, Aidan. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl. Kyndryl runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more at kyndryl.com.